This exhibition has a very fabulous title, Fata Morgana, Crocoland, and the Odd Superior Mirage. I think we can understand the first and the last, but what and where is Crocoland?
Right, Crocoland doesn't actually exist, and that's the really interesting thing about it. It was purported to exist by an explorer of the Northwest Passage through the Arctic and North America. And it's quite a complicated story, so I won't go into it, but basically he said, whoever it was, the leader of the expedition, said, I've seen this land, it's huge, but we couldn't get to it. But I've named it Crocoland after you, Mr. Crocker. We hope you will fund our next expedition. Which basically he did. And so it's about something that's there in the mind, but not there. And there seem to be lots of incidences of that in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. I don't know about the Antarctic, but...
And is this analogous, do you think, with being an explorer as an artist? Of trying to find maybe, Fata Morgana is another kind of image or dream.
Yes.
A mirage.
Yes.
Is that analogous with being creative, do you think?
Well, the interesting thing, in the Arctic there are two main sorts of mirages. One they call Fata Morgana, and one they call superior mirage. The Fata Morgana is when you see a horizon, and then an image is sitting on that horizon, it's sitting down. And the Fata Morgana comes from Fata is Italian slang for fairy. Morgana comes from Morgan, the Arthurian legend witch. And I haven't read it myself, but in the Straits of Messina there was a mirage, and everything got named after that. The superior mirage is when the conditions are right, and it's all to do with layers of cold air and warm air, when an image that can be out of sight beyond the horizon actually appears floating above the horizon. So you could have a big ship, for example, floating in the sky. And that refers basically to these three paintings. Yes. Are you? Okay, I will do.
Yeah. And these are the kind of mirages which also occur in other kinds of deserts. So you've got the tabula rasa of the Arctic or of the desert, and then this phenomena, which is, it's kind of actual in the sense that it's about physical phenomena of light, but it's also fantastical. So it's a very enthralling kind of concept, I think, around which to understand and interpret this group of works. I had to confess to Bill that I hadn't realised that he also worked in two dimensions. I've known him and his work for many years as primarily a sculptor. So these came as a surprise to me. Can you say something about the evolution of these and the relation between the chalk images and the backgrounds?
Could take quite a while, but I call them paintings now, as opposed to drawings, although they've got drawing on them, because I'm trying to make that break from drawing to painting. But don't ask me where the line is. I've been making paintings like this for some years now, probably since 2005, 6, but on a slightly smaller scale. And they started off as a response to seeing the Aurora Borealis in the north of Norway, which I saw one year when I was fishing in the very north. And it was midnight, and I was up to my thighs in water, connected to the earth. I mean, really sort of connected, felt connected. And then suddenly this phenomena happened in the sky above, and it was quite amazing and sort of spine-chilling and hair standing up, and just a fantastic experience. But it was too much of an experience to make work from immediately. So it wasn't until a few years later that somehow it started to creep into some drawings which were to do with a horizon, a very big sky, something happening in the sky, and a sort of compression down onto the earth. Anyway, so that was the very beginning. These are the latest sort of form of that. And they started with the horizon and just all the colour. They didn't have any drawings or the black on them at all. And they get made and then they sit around the studio for a while or pinned to the wall, and I look at them as I come in every day, and then at some point something clicks and I have to do something more to them. And so these layers built up, putting an image over the one layer and then breaking up that image to a certain extent with the black shapes or holes. So that's the physical evolution of them. The title of Superior Mirage came very late, as titles generally do. And I was reading about these mirages, as I sort of explained, and the differences, and I thought, that's exactly what's happening here. These things are above the horizon, they're in. So that's what the Superior Mirage is.
And what kind of a boat is that? That looks like
a galleon.
A galleon,
yes.
Historic.
And they, in choosing the image to go on there, that's an interesting bit. And I can't always be very eloquent about that, how that happens. But I do know with the galleon one, I was thinking about an image that sort of related to the boats crossing the Mediterranean with the refugees. But I didn't want to make a very direct image of that. So this sort of refers to that in a way, but it's sort of like being cast adrift. It's almost like a mutiny image. And the
mosquito?
The mosquito, I'm not sure. You know, it's sort of the insects will win. It's that sort of thing, I think.
And this is a satellite?
A satellite, yes. Well, we're absolutely dependent on them for everything, whether we like it or not. And so it's sort of it's in the sky. Well, it's above, it's in space, and but you can see them with the naked eye.
I mean, what's clear, looking around this room, is that there's a very strong presence of the natural world. And yet, in 1981, when I first interviewed you, I remember very clearly you're speaking about a generation that had preceded you, including artists like Richard Long and Hamish Fulton. And you said very definitively at that time, you did not want to bring rural souvenirs into the gallery.
Well, look, okay. I absolutely admit that I did say that, similar things to that. And there were these sort of rustic machinations of different artists. But actually, it wasn't very long before I did some similar things myself. I think as a student, or just or post being a student, I was quite sort of anti the rustic, if you like, because I'd come from that. I'd come to a city and I wanted the work to be urban. Yeah, we can change.
I mean, what was astounding about seeing your work for the first time was the first piece I saw was the washing machine with the bicycle cut out of it. And it was a kind of moment of recognition, which I imagine someone might have had looking at Duchamp's Urania. It was like, of course. And you knew it. You knew it was about Peckham High Street or the Holloway Road, or you knew it was about the urban detritus and its abject beauty. You knew also that there was this sense of the metamorphosis. And what I think was interesting, even at that point, was this sense of connecting totally disparate elements and making them organically linked, often through some kind of metamorphosis. In the 1980s, also, you would there's a fantastic work called Car Door, Ironing Board, and Twin Tub with North American headdress. And so, interestingly enough, at that time, there's also a consistent reference to ethnography, so that you'd have something which is absolutely about Western technology, the redundant Western technologies, obsolescence, the kind of consumer material culture, and then you would juxtapose it with, there's another piece with an African mask on a totem, or with this symbol, or almost like a kind of shortcut for an indigenous culture.
But what's I think you should understand was how that I got to the Indian headdress. Mm-hmm. And it's not, at that point, it wasn't because I was doing research and interested in anthropology or ethnic groups or anything. In my children's toy box, there was an Indian headdress made with chicken feathers. Mm-hmm. And I was looking at this and I thought, how did it get there? You know, it's come from here. My kids will put it on and it's made of chicken feathers and a bit of cheap plastic. And I was just fascinated by the journey that image had gone through. So at that point, it becomes, I wanted to use the image, and it becomes a really fantastic reason to make a sculpture. And that underlies everything. There's a need for me to make things. And in a way, the headdress or the aurora borealis or whatever, they are just triggers for me to be able to actually get on and make something.
Now, you came directly after a time when contemporary art was really dominated by very conceptually based practices, which stressed language, idea over object, the dematerialization, really, of the object, the role of the index, and so on and so forth. So was that part of a reaction against that, this idea of wanting to work with metals and materiality?
I don't think it was a reaction. I think it was just a need that I had to be engaged physically with materials. But I needed to do that with in a way that was intellectual, and I don't mean that in an arrogant way, but as sort of a way of thinking using a visual language and making things so that what you made eventually sort of had some sense to it.
And were you influenced by people like Oldenburg, or who were you looking at that time?
No, I think at that point, strangely enough, my favourite artists were some of the conceptualists and the minimalists. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I adore those very early stellar copper paintings, and Solowit, all that crowd. I thought they were really fantastic because they broke through a lot of ground. Yeah. But it wasn't something that I wanted to do. But they certainly influenced me, I think, and especially, possibly Carl. I remember seeing a Carl Andre show at the Listen Gallery, very early one, which was just twisted rebar, which is the reinforcing bar, bits of twisted rebar on the ground. And you'd walk in there and you'd think, oh, this just looks like it's thrown some bar down. But actually it's very specifically placed. And there isn't an aesthetic to it. And I think that notion of things not being random sort of, and stayed with me, well, it's still with me very much so, but with the cutout work, sometimes it looks really all over the place and random, but it's not. They're very specifically placed. And that came from looking at that work.
Yeah, and in fact, the whole Ros Kraus thing about sculpture in the expanded field, I mean, it's quite striking. There's an amazing work, which I think is in the Tate collection, called Elephant. And this thing just spreads from these huge elephant ears in the centre, and they connect up, I think, to 2 washing machines. But what you get is this sense of an environment. So it isn't a singular object contained by the plinth, it's something which defines a space and a spatial, phenomenological field of experience for the viewer. The other thing that strikes me about these multivalent works, which one thing leading to another, a washing machine leading to a Indian headdress leading to an ironing board, is this sense of narrative. That you see this image in one, but you also think about how these things add up together. Could you say something about that? Because you're making very legible images, they're not abstract.
Yes, I think there are a couple of things. I think I was always interested in narrative and in the story and in images, but I was also very interested in abstract things as well, and abstract shapes. And when I was a student at St Martin's, with a few other people in the room, there were these things called sculpture forums, and any mention of narrative was totally forbidden, really. And I kind of, if somebody tells me not to do something, it becomes much more interesting all of a sudden. And so I thought, well, this is worth exploring. I think that it just happens. It's not like I sit down and say, I'm going to make a narrative work. I make a work, and that's how it turns out. And then you start to understand how it comes about. And I remember making work as a student and being, what's this narrative stuff, It's kind of, and that's sort of slightly red rag.
And at that time also, the same phenomena was happening in painting. I mean, these huge, monumentally epic-scaled works by Kiefer or Schnabel, Clementi. I mean, I remember the New Generation in Painting show at the Royal Academy, where suddenly abstraction disappeared and we were back to history painting and figuration and so forth, but in a very radical new way. And then in 2000 you moved into away from the found object, which really had characterised your work until then, into bronze. What made you take that direction?
It was actually a lot earlier than 2000. I stopped making cutout work and stopped collecting found material, probably the late 80s, 89, 90, basically because I was bored to the teeth with it. And I knew what I was doing, and the work just became more and more sort of complex and sophisticated, but for no reason, just because I was trying to stick with something, and it wasn't interesting to me. So I stopped doing that, and I thought, well, if I'm going to use materials, I can use new materials too if I want to. I can buy materials. And I made an exhibition at the Imperial War Museum as a response to the museum in 1989, and I'd made a whole series of works, but I made them in cardboard. And I sort of realised every time I moved them about, they got damaged, something would fall off. Cardboard is really a beautiful material, but It's not very strong. So I thought at that point I would try transferring that into another material, i.e. bronze. And I also had a bit of money at that point, so I could afford to do that. And the financial side of casting bronze is a very important aspect because it's very expensive. And so that, in 1989, that was the first time I'd used bronze for a full show. I'd made one or two little things in Seattle. I made a couple of things for a show, but they were very small. So I was just getting into that.
Mm-hmm. But it starts then to be about unifying the shape, I think. I mean, looking over works from that period, instead of having those very large-scale installations, inevitably it tended to then become perhaps more contained, would you say?
It's more contained. It has a very different surface. You treat the surface in a way, it has a different weight, has a different temperature, everything is different. You know, a bronze cast of something is not the same as the prototype. It's a totally different animal.
But the prototype was still something that you'd found?
No, I was making from scratch, yeah, out of any material that I had.
And then that came to prominence really, I would say, most publicly with the fourth plinth, which I'm sure people do remember that amazing work, which also brings the idea of allegory into the work. So tell us something about how you conceptualised that piece.
Well, it's regardless of history. It's another long story. I was making a piece of work for an exhibition in Italy, and I got a stonemason to carve an image of me, of my head. But it was to be huge, this sort of size. And I'd been told that this stonemason, who lived on top of a mountain, did things for churches and stuff, was very good. So I went and selected a piece of stone with him, and I said, just take some photographs and work from that. And I came back 2 months later, just before the show started, and went to see what this stonemason had produced. And I used a stonemason because I don't know about stone carving myself, and I didn't have the time to sort of experiment. So I knew what I wanted, so I asked this person to do it. And when I went into the stone yard, and he said, "There it is," I sort of looked at it, and I went, and the block had hardly been touched, and it looked, this huge thing, it looked like a cross between an Easter Island head and Mussolini. I was speechless, because it was not what I was expecting. But time was short, and I had to do something with it. So, I said, yeah, okay, great. And as I walked around it and looked at it again and again, I sort of got to like it because it was just so crazy. I mean, it really was a wacky thing. And the idea was that I was going to cast some big coins, make my own coins and cast them, and then stick them all into the head. And this was going to be called Money Head. I'd sort of got that bit worked out because there was a deadline approaching, so I had to do that. And so it went ahead, and it's actually a piece of work I really enjoyed because, A, it didn't look like me, thank goodness, in the end. But that, okay, now getting back to the original question, that started off a sort of series of works to do with heads and things attached to them. And the next one was called Listening to History, which I'd made my own head, and then made a book, and the book was bound to the head with rope, so it covered your ear, you couldn't hear, and the rope that bound it to you covered your eyes, so you couldn't hear, so you could just listen to history in terms of the book. Then I was asked to submit something for the fourth plinth, and so the fourth plinth, regardless of history, is a sort of the next work that I would have made, actually, which was the really good thing about it, that it wasn't, I didn't have to think of something totally new. I was sort of on the move, and the work happened. And I'd been looking at images of fallen dictators' statues where they're pulled over, probably Saddam Hussein and people, I don't know the dates, but lots of things like that where there are fallen heads. Somebody was quite certain that it was a severed head, but it's a fallen head. Then the head, again, had the book, so listening to history, but then there was a tree growing all over it, so the roots would bind it all together. And I wanted to use, I was really adamant that the plinth in Trafalgar Square had to be part of the sculpture. It wasn't something that the sculpture was just plonked on. And so the roots came all over the plinth and attached everything together, so it unified the whole thing. And I think that the image of the tree and the roots came from looking or seeing some photographs of temples that have been overtaken by the jungle.
Where is that work now?
It's at Sculpture at Goodwood.
Oh. One of the great conundrums about the Fourth Plinth project is what happens to
the work.
So
nice
huge.
of you to offer.
Perhaps more successful collaboration than the one with the stone carver, although it sounded like it resolved itself very well, was with your friend and collaborator who's here tonight, Richard Deacon.
Mm-hmm.
That has been a very long-term relationship, and you've made exhibitions together. Could you say something about that?
Well, it's kept going because we started in a way that wouldn't, in a sense, how can I put it, affect each other or hurt each other in terms of we worked separately and exchanged things. And then we gradually got more relaxed, I guess, and interested in different ways of working. And we can now work together in the same space really easily. And it's and I always look forward to it greatly because it takes me, and I'm sure Richard as well, I hope, to places that I wouldn't go. And it does influence my own work post that.
Like Plymouth.
Sorry?
Like Plymouth.
Like Plymouth.
Never go there.
Oh, places like that, yes. No, I meant sculptural places, really. Conceptual places. And it results in work that probably neither of us would make as individuals. But it has influenced my work afterwards in as much as that I realise, oh yeah, I can do that. That's okay, I can use that kind of shape or abstraction or method or all sorts of things. And what's I find very interesting about the work that we make together is that when people are looking at it, they're sometimes really adamant about who makes what. And it ain't like that. It doesn't always work that way.
You made an amazing installation in the South London Gallery in 2000, I think. And it was the first time that I'd seen you make a figure. And that figure also was a very particular character. It was called the Beekeeper. And it was like a gigantic puppet. So could you tell us about the evolution of that project?
Well, it's still kind of going on. It started in just the late 90s, 1996. I had an exhibition of big bronze works, sort of what you termed allegorical works, at Tate Britain in the Devine Galleries, right the way through the Devine Galleries. And after that show, there was the classic kind of post-exhibition blues and, what am I going to do now? And so I thought, what I'll do now is I'll work from a theme, which I hadn't done before. I mean, sometimes it appears there's a theme, but it kind of doesn't, I don't choose it, it just appears. So I spent a couple of months thinking about different potential themes, you know, probably every day going to the studio doing different things. But none of them stuck in my head until one day the two words, the beekeeper. I don't know where it came from. I just thought of it and I thought, yes, you know, because it's visually rich, it's conceptually rich, and it's, in terms of natural systems and produce, it's really fascinating, and I know nothing about it. So I think I started making work sort of almost immediately, but then I went on a beekeeping course for a weekend, which did change a lot of things. I understood it a lot more. And one of the things that came through just making the work was to make this a marionette, which was all, and who was the beekeeper. And there were different scenarios that this marionette was in, which related to, I think at that time, global warming was very much in the news, and I was thinking about it. And so there's a lot of sort of stickiness and things melting and shields from the sun. But again, it's I was going to say an excuse, but it's not an excuse. It's a way of starting to make something, getting this theme. And it was incredibly rich, and it just kept going and going and going.
And it seemed to give you an excuse to use viscosity and
all sorts
colour
of
in a different way. There would be these kind of gloops of amber, honey-like substance that appeared to be dripping out of other structures. I mean, it really did move the work, I think.
Well, I started working with
direction.
glassmakers too, to get those sort of shapes, and that was fascinating. It's a big body of work.
And this idea of a character, there's a series you made in 2005 called The Evaluators and The Navigators. So how did that come into the work, this idea of a persona with a project?
I don't know, titles are strange things, because if you make, I made a lot of work, and those well, if you make a whole group of work, you can just number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know. But it doesn't really help you when you come to find something, because you don't know what number 3 looks like any more than number 6. But if it's got a title, then it can give you a reference to that work, and it can be another layer of potential meaning to the work. So the sculptures you're talking about were made. Parts of them were made by, they had a base that was then laminated with formica, coloured formica, and they're very crisp, beautiful things made by a furniture maker, because, I mean, I could make them, but they would not look like this guy could make them. And so they were to be a base or something that the sculpture that I made was attached to, and the stuff that I made, I wanted to be the opposite in the feel and the look of that really crisp, beautiful colour. And they're all named after the trade colour. So there's a one which is called, for example, Kimono Navigator, and kimono was the name of that colour. And I made a few, and I can't remember why I called them navigators, but then once I'd called them navigators, then I made some other ones which were different, so I had to think of something that was like navigator in the sound, and it came up with evaluator, or I think there were a couple of others, but I'd have to look through the records for that.
But it does suggest a kind of mise en scène. It gives a sense of action, some agent behind these works. Moving now to this body of works around us, we see, or I see for the first time in your work, but the use of ceramics. and incredibly beautiful, also very fragile looking pieces, like the juxtaposition in the corner there of these igloos with shards of what could be, I suppose we might read them as ice or so forth. Could you tell us about how you moved into using ceramics?
It's very simple. It's cheap. Cheaper than bronze.
Yeah.
Cheaper, yeah. I have worked with ceramics since, but not very often, and I'm to make components of a sculpture, not a total sculpture. And I would made a lot of skulls out of ceramic, and eventually got my own kiln so I could fire them. I don't really do glazes, because although the one eel behind here is glazed, it took quite a few eels to get to that point, and I don't have the patience to wait for that. So I use ceramics, and I like painting it because it's instant and you get what you want. Then I suppose with these ones, it's every work leads on to something else, and there's a sort of this heritage, and this is the next work from this and this and this, and there's a connection between. You don't always see it, but when you look in retrospect, you can see it. And so the work up there with the sort of the mountain scenes on it is derived from a much bigger work that was made out of plywood and painted and drawn on. This ceramic piece here and the ones on Crockerland they're painted and then they're drawn on with coloured pencil, and that drawing on with the coloured pencil comes from some drawings that I made, two-dimensional drawings, again to do with the Aurora Borealis, where I used a lot of lines just with coloured pencil on the sky bit. So it was like a transfer from that to the three-dimensional ceramics, and it was just in the initial piece, it was an experimentation. You know, what would this look like? You know, can I do this? Can I make a three-dimensional thing which has two dimensions? And the thinking about that came. I was thinking a lot about landscape and how sculptors deal with landscape. And there aren't, to my mind, that many sort of great examples. I mean, Smith does some, and Caro did some, yeah. And so I was thinking about that, and so it's sort of my cheating in a way, of making a three-dimensional thing and then putting a two-dimensional image around on it to see if it worked.
I think these are absolutely wonderful, and on the one hand you get these live sense of life through the eels just because of their movement, and the kind of exuberance of the rope hanging from that. Or there's a piece behind us where there's a beautiful green, emerald green eel with, again, rope pouring from beneath it. And you get this sense of organic dynamism and life, and at the same time, tremendous fragility, because these things look paper thin. They perhaps remind us of ice, of standing on very thin ice. Again, I get this kind of sense of an allegory with them. So the put together, there seems to be a politics in this work.
Carry on.
I mean, do you see yourself in some way as an activist?
Yes. But I'm not what I would say a street corner activist. I'm not selling newspapers on the corner for this, that or the other. And I'm just, these are things, and all those things come out because that's me, and you know, it's making the work is just getting stuff out of your head. So I would say yes to that, but it's not an in-your-face thing at all, and it's not something. I wouldn't, although I'm a member of Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, I would not volunteer my work for them to use, because it's not political, it's not propaganda in that sense, it's sculpture. And it's for me, I make it for myself, and initially, not for other people. So
there's also a kind of sense of enchantment, going back to the title. And I wondered, could you say something about this stoppered bottle? Does it have a genie inside it? What's its role? How did that come to be in this configuration with the rope? And
I think one of the things about this group of work is that I was using material that was in the studio already, and the rope works, I had a lot of coils of rope, and so a lot of these things started from a material base rather than a conceptual base. That particular work took some months to get to that stage, because I'd made different bits, the sort of broken shards, the white shards, I'd put together, and then it was around the studio, and I didn't know what to do with it, but I knew it was a sort of a component, potential component, and the rope, coil of rope I wanted to use. And then sort of one day the three of them came together, and then the next day the rope got painted red, and then a couple of days later the block at the bottom got painted blue. It was a different shape for a long time, but then it got cut down to a block. And then in that configuration it still wasn't enough. And on the shelf, one of the shelves in where the tools are in the studio, I have lots of bits and pieces, and that glass stopper, decanter was there, and it was given to me by my friend Sid Garner, who's an antiques restorer, and he gave it to me because it had a hole in it. It's a very beautiful, really thin glass, but it had been knocked, and a very clean hole in the side of it, and he gave it to me, and it's been in the studio probably for 20 years, at least. And I was just walking around and, right, that's it. And then the rest sort of followed from that.
It strikes me as being...
And the work is called Flow, as F-L-O-E, as in ice flow. But there's a sort of, I kind of like the thing about flow, because there's a flow coming out of the broken hole. F-L-O-W, I guess.
I think of it as being like sculptural, analogous with poetry. You know, that it has these, each one of these signifies in a different way, but then put together it's like words in a poem. I think it's an incredibly beautiful work. Bill, you've moved from Peckham. You've abandoned London. And you're now living in the countryside.
Yes.
Has that affected
doing rustic
your
things.
Work? Doing rustic things. Has that changed your work?
It probably it has. I mean, I've made. Well, just in terms of materials, you find different materials. You know, I've got a log store for the wood burner. You know, it's stacked with logs. And a few years ago, I made a series of works about the anaconda snakes and the people that hunt them and gather them, because I saw some images which were really beautiful, sculptural forms of this huge snake flopped over shoulders and 3 or 4 people carrying this one snake. And one of the works I made is sort of like a train which has lots of logs from the log store on each carriage, so to speak, and painted different colours. So, yes, it does, in some way or other. In terms of the difference between urban or city and the countryside, I'm still in both because I'm here. My studio is still in London.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't work at home at all, really. So I'm up here during the week.
On that note, I'd like to ask if you have any questions or comments. It's a really rare opportunity to be with an artist right next to the work, which I think is so exciting. So if anyone wants to ask about the technique as well, this is your chance.
You've got 3 seconds and I'm off.
Would these be chromosomes?
The black shape.
No, the twin.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that, but I see what you mean. Yeah. No, they could be.
So there's life on other.
Yeah, it's not. For me, these paintings were experimenting with colour. I mean, I've really got into working with colour, and so I hadn't given any.
It's just the symmetrical pairing, and they're different shapes, but they're always a symmetrical pair.
Now I see what you mean, but I hadn't thought of that at all. They were abstract. Yep.
Could I ask a little about this beautiful piece?
Yes.
Did you create the shapes and the flatness and then compile, or are some baked together, touching the sort of planes and the curls touching and then baked? I'd love to know how you did that.
I started making. The ceramicists in the room will know about paper clay, which you can roll into very thin sheets, and it's really interesting because it's quite resistant and it's quite tough, even when it's very thin, and you just glue it together with slip, and then you make a form and you put it in the kiln, and it comes out nothing like what you put in.
So it went in the kiln like that?
Yes, that came out of the kiln like that. And because in the firing process, the heat, at a certain point, the thing gets very fluid and floppy, I guess. And then it gets, everything starts to move a bit. So there's this chance thing that happens. So the form is,
What comes
sort
out?
of, well, it's pretty much as it is there, but it's slightly
Because
distorted.
there's that lovely curve that looks like it's going to fall, and then it's like a biscuit clay, so it takes the pencil.
It's painted. No, it's a sort
you
of like a
painted
white.
it, it's not-
a stoneware. It's a stoneware clay, and then it's painted with a very thin sort of wash a few times, and then drawn on.
And the plinth is part of the. It's not
yes.
quite a plinth.
Yeah.
It's
No,
actually
it's part of it.
sculpture.
Yeah.
Lovely texture.
Thank you. I just had a question in regards to, I feel like all the work is about witnessing a landscape, so it's outside of the body. But that work there, I don't know why, it's very striking to me. It actually reminds me of, I saw a video of these worms that you can get in your intestines. And it's a video of a surgeon trying to take them out. That's what it reminds me. And the intestines, and things like this experience of being inside the body, does the body have a role in your work? What is that?
The body does occasionally, as Iwona alluded, making the marionette. Which is the nearest sort of that I would get to a total human form. I have made some ceramic heads of bearded men because I was in a museum in Luxembourg looking at some Roman carvings of these bearded Romans, and they're all very bearded and they're all very... And I thought, when I got home, I wonder if I could make one of those. And so I made these ceramic heads, not by looking at a model or anything or myself or whatever, just made some heads. And then, which is really interesting, and then I put beards on them. And it was quite extraordinary how immediately it changed, and you suddenly got this historic stereotype of the philosopher or the wise man or something. This beard thing was really quite strange. And so those are the most naturalistic things I've made. And the heads, the one on the big fallen head on the Trafalgar Square piece, regardless of history. But I've never made a full figure. I possibly would in the future, I don't know. As for the worms, yeah. I can see again your thing, but for me, when I made that, the rope coming out of that was a totally abstract thing, but then it did suggest water at a certain point.
Well, I think, sorry.
What's with the eel, Bill? Is that... Was your fishing...
Yes. There were quite a few ceramic eels left in the studio in much the same way as the stopper jar, because one of the works that the evaluator or navigator works was like a huge pond or a recess which was full of ceramic eels. And this was a sort of a reference to, it's me remembering being in Ireland with some friends who have a mill, and they have an eel trap. And on a very stormy nights, at certain times of the year, the eels all come down the river and they get caught in the trap. And literally the trap can be this sort of size, and it's a big sort of tray, and you can be up to your knees in eels. And I've sort of seen this and witnessed this, and it's quite extraordinary. And so this work had sort of references to that experience. And the eels in here are ones that were left over and hadn't found their way back to the Sargasso. And they got caught up in this work. Yep.
Hi. You said that all those pieces behind you, the paintings,
Yes,
which started as a drawings, were initially inspired by the experience of the Aurora Borealis. So
But many sort of paintings back, yeah, and they changed a lot.
What struck me here that you also were saying about the mirages, and then there is a horizon and something happens that is a phenomenon. But to me, it has this sense that it's almost a little bit like you transcribing the natural phenomena onto the abstract form. It's a little bit like a map making. I don't know if you would agree.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, because I think there's a point where the work is almost abstract, although it has this horizon and a river or path. So you have a hint of a realistic image. And I like very much to counter that by putting on a very realistic image on top of something that is abstract. So you're correct.
Hand up.
I was going to ask, what do you think about the artists who've been making the same thing for the last 20 years, but they're in the top 20 richest man in the country?
Well, in their mind, they're not making the same thing every time, but they're...
Do you wish you'd been still cutting things?
No, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I'm not like that. I need to change.
But would you say the galleries expect artists to have a brand? do the same thing?
I have come across that pressure. And I'm no longer with that gallery. So it's a tricky one, that. Yeah, it's a very long conversation, but I get your drift. Any more? Yep.
I think, Bill, what you bring to your work is wit, really. There's a very lively, witty aspect of what you do, which I think is a definitive aspect of what you do. Not only the two-dimensional, but also the three-dimensional.
How would you define wit?
Well, it's a lively, thoughtful, quasi-comic approach to. I mean, think about this evil man. It doesn't seem to be a rather witty reference.
I mean, it's not something I don't start out to make witty work. It just happens. You know, so that's so these are byproducts. Yes, absolutely.
A lot of sculptors use drawing as either a starting point or work in parallel to their 3D work. How do you think about that? Because I can't think of you producing drawings that I've seen.
I produce hundreds of drawings, but they're very separate. Most of the time, they're separate to the sculpture. They're not a means of finding out how to make the sculpture or anything like that. They are separate pieces of work. And the great thing about drawings is that they're immediate. And so if you have some time when you're not occupied with something, or you haven't started a sculpture, you've got time and you can make drawings, and as soon as you put a mark on a piece of paper, you're off.
But they're not diagrams to be made into sculptures.
No, they're very separate things. But there is a relation to the sculpture in the sense that the subject matter can be the same. Because, for example, making the igloos and looking at Inuit archives and images and things, I got really fascinated by kayaks. And I had a fantastic long conversation with Stefan Geck about kayaks, and he was really interested in kayaks too. And I started making drawings of kayaks, and they turned into paintings, and it's just a start. So you have a form, and the form of an Inuit kayak is really interesting, and they're a handmade thing, so there is that sort of relationship, but it's not to inform how to make a sculpture.
So you wouldn't consider exhibiting drawings particularly much as a separate?
Oh yes, I have done.
I can't think offhand.
Well, not recently. I mean, in 1996 at the Camden Art Centre, I had a big show of just big drawings, black and white drawings. And yeah, I'm making drawings all the time because the reward is instant, and I like that. It's, yeah.
There's one question. Yes, so you saw the black ribbons in the paintings, and they remind me of the metal that cuts in the washing machine, the Indian chip threads. I just wondered if you were conscious of that, and if that was meant.
No, but I can see, because when I started making these, it's not the first time I've made drawings with black shapes on it. And when I first made the black shapes on the mosquito was the first one, because I wanted again to break up the image of the mosquito because it was too obvious. It was just as simple as that. And then so I put the black shapes on, and then that didn't really sort of work. So I drew around the black shape with just the white, and that sort of the shapes then flipped between a torn hole and something that's sort of laid on the top. So it wasn't a conscious connection to the other things.
I think that was a good question. So I've been interested in I always liked that connection. And I hadn't connected
in the drawing.
Black things to the placental link in the other thing. But I've been wondering whether wax, either in bronze casting or in beekeeping, also serves the same function.
Not consciously. No.
And do you think that when you started, do you think the wax from bronze casting had some relationship to you becoming interested in beekeeping?
No. I don't know, because with the bronze casting, you make the, as you know, you make the maquette or the prototype, which could be made out of anything. It could be made out of wax, but quite often with my material was cardboard or just anything that was knocking around. Then it goes, you take it to the foundry, because you can't cast things in bronze yourself because it's very labour intensive, etc., etc. And at a certain point in that process, as you know, it gets, that thing you made gets turned into a wax piece. Now, I would never be there when that happened.
I remember lots of wax on bits of cardboard in your studio.
Well, that might be something else. I'm not sure that that was for casting. That would be more, you could be more precise, Mr. Deacon.
Well, bees use wax.
Yeah.
And the wax, and you seem to use wax in quite particular ways. And I've always connected with your use of wax somehow to bronze casting, but I may be kind of wrong there. Actually, we were just using wax like as something that was solidified when you put it on top of the.
Yeah.
When you put it on top of something else.
You can melt it and you can draw with it on surfaces if you pour it and things. But I'd never connected that, the bronze, to.
But it goes missing.
It goes
missing.
Missing. Yes.
So you said that your work was political, but you don't particularly want to talk about it being
well, I don't,
be appropriated by politics.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was interesting how you came to a shift through the migration and refugee crisis, and wondered a bit about how the background actually in that context looks a bit more like camouflage, and how you've replaced a raft with what looks more like a colonial vessel, and if there's what the thoughts would be.
It's more, I think it also, it's about being cast adrift from a boat, from a large vessel, in smaller boats. So that, I'm sure, happened in history a lot in terms of either mutinies or they just wanted to get rid of extra. I mean, they probably threw slaves overboard. Well, they did throw slaves overboard, not probably. But they also might have just cast them adrift in boats as well. So I think there's a sort of connection between the history and the current day, that things are still happening in a very similar way.
Yeah, it's almost like the work is like a radio transmitter, I think, that it's absorbing the world as it evolves around us, but even if not consciously, inevitably, intuitively, it's going to be expressed in this work.
Yeah, it's what was in my head that morning, or that day, or something, or that week.
Yeah, and the fact that it absorbs figurative and purely formal elements gives it that freedom, I think. And the only thing that we know about the future is that when the next Bill Woodrow show comes along, it's going to be a surprise. And I think that's what's so exciting about your work. So I think we're going to draw things to a close. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to both of you. That was
Well, thank you, Iwona.